Good afternoon and welcome to today's CFA Boston webinar on shared caregiving, how fathers may hold the key to women's advancement. My name is Michael Grice and I'm your host for this afternoon session. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Society's Women's Initiative Programs Committee, which I have the privilege and pleasure of co-chairing along with my colleague and friend Eileen Dury. I want to be very clear in saying that our committee is not focused on developing events and programs for women. We are focused on providing programs that support the professional development of all our members in support of building a more diverse and therefore a more effective and welcoming profession. And those of you who have followed some of the writings and speakings of Mark Franklin, the head and the president of the CFA Institute, this is a topic on which she speaks most eloquently, the importance of diversity of ideas in our profession, both internally and in doing and achieving good investment results. So we welcome your suggestions as a committee, your suggestions, questions, ideas, and involvement. I encourage you to reach out directly to me or through our CFA Boston staff. If the chat feature is enabled, and I'm not 100% sure it is, I'll put my email there, but you can always reach out to our committee through that. In our work, through this COVID-19 episode moving virtual, we have been thinking as a committee how we can provide programs that will respond to kind of current needs in the environment. And this is a topic that we thought resonated actually quite a bit. And as I pointed out, there have been some recent articles in the Boston Globe with the headline, "Men are taking on slightly more household chores during pandemic." And in the New York Times, nearly half of men say they do most of the homeschooling, 3% of women agree. And our goal is not to get into that sort of a dispute, but to recognize that now many of us in two working couple families are at home working and trying to deal with a lot of things, maybe childcare, education, our professional responsibilities, our personal responsibilities. And so the question of how men and women advance and support each other in their profession has probably been never been more important. So in seeking someone to talk about that, I had the pleasure of reaching out to the Boston College Center for Work and Family and to Brad Harrington, who is the executive director there. Brad has been at the center for, 10, 15 years now. He came to Boston College after being executive at Hewlett-Packard for 20 years, served in business unit and global leadership roles in the US and Europe. In our conversation about the work in the center, Brad mentioned that he had started working on the question of fathers and their role in women's advancement probably over 10 years ago, and started a research program, which sounded fascinating. So I will obviously let him provide that introduction, but Brad's going to talk about that research, what's going on with it, and his work with companies in kind of exploring this issue and in looking at ways that we can advance women's role in the workplace through shared caregiving. So I will turn it over to you, Brad. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael. I'm happy to be here. Let me just take 1 minute to get my screen shared with folks. Let me do this. And then we'll here and view presentation. So is that working well for everybody?
That looks perfect. Thank you.
You're most welcome. So thanks, Michael. I'm doing this from my backyard, as most of you are probably also working from your house or your yard or whatever it might be on such a glorious day. Thank you for having me here. And I know there's an awful lot going on these days. So, between the pandemic, the incredible rate of unemployment on the increase, and with the Black Lives Matter movement. So there's a lot of strong messages and themes going on in the world today. And I appreciate you taking the opportunity to chat about something that's a little outside of the mainstream right now, which is what's happening with fathers. Father's Day is coming up in about a week and a half or 2 weeks. And so this is always a good month of the year to kind of review what's going on with fathers and to talk today a little bit about what's going on with dads, but also specifically, how does what's going on with fathers impact women and women's advancement? So I'll be taking you through some research we've been doing for the past 10 years, as Michael said, at the center. Let me give a quick introduction to myself.
I apologize. I did neglect to remind folks that the Q&A feature is available. And please, if you have questions, share them during Brad's talk, and we will, when Brad's finished, we'll open it up and try to handle as many questions as we can. Sorry, Brad, continue, please.
Yeah, I'll try to get through these in a quick enough time that we'll have 15 minutes or so at the end if people want to ask questions. So just by way of introduction, Michael already gave me a nice one. I've been at the center now, this is my 20th year. It'll be 20 years in September. So I've had really, I worked for the government for a couple of years, but mainly, as Michael said, I've worked in Hewlett Packard, high tech, both in the US and Europe, and had a number of global roles there, mostly in the human resource area or leadership development areas. And then about 20 years ago, I decided to make a career change, and I moved into Boston College, where I'm a research professor in the School of Management at BC and also the director of our Center for Work and Family. And this is the center's 30th year. It was founded by a guy named Brad Googans, and it's been around for 30 years. And by way of, what is the center about? The center was established early on by a number of big corporations who were interested in how the increasing number of women into professional and managerial positions was going to impact the workplace. And the main focus when the center was first established in 1990 was how do women with young children going to balance the work and family challenges that they've been presented with. We've been at this work for a long time, and our mantra is to try to tie together research and practice. So one of the things we try to do within BC is really reach beyond the borders of just the university and talk with employers about how research can inform their human resource practices and their management development practices and so forth. So we've always tried to play that boundary spanning role. And from the very start, in addition to doing research and providing educational programs, our goal has been to really impact the world of practice. And so let me just show you kind of a sampling or a list of who the organizations are that support our work through membership and partnership. So as you'll see by looking at this, maybe if many of you work for one of these organizations, we tend to work with pretty marquee name employers. They run across a lot of different sectors. We have technology companies, pharmaceuticals, investment banking, professional services, insurance, pharma, high tech, higher education, as well as some hospitality firms as well. So what you can see by the member organizations we work with is, first of all, they're very large, almost all Fortune 500 or more Fortune 100 companies. The second thing is, as I said, they work across a pretty wide spectrum of industries. The third is they tend to be very well respected within their industry niches. So they tend to be organizations that are perceived as having pretty progressive workforce management practices. And they've been terrific to us in terms of supporting us in our work, giving us sites to do our research, attending our educational forums and so forth. So one of the real pleasures of this role is I get to live in an academic environment and do research and teaching on the faculty at Boston College, but I also have even a greater opportunity to work with a really outstanding group of employers to sort of talk about how we can move our ideas into the mainstream. How we got started on this series, and the reason why I think I don't know what the breakdown of attendees is today in terms of women versus men, but occasionally women might say, why do I care about new dad research? How is that relevant or interesting to me? And what I hope to do by the end of this presentation is show you that how important it is for women to have a partner who is very actively involved and connected to their work, and also is taking on their share of responsibilities in the home as well. So how we got engaged in this work was about 10 years ago, after I had been in my role for 10 years. It became really, really clear to me that the conversation around work, family, and work-life balance was one where men were kind of disconnected from the conversation. And specifically, what I thought was that fathers tended not to be, when we talked about working families and the challenges for working families, fathers were oftentimes very much an afterthought. So after attending, years of conferences and making presentations and so forth, one of the things that struck me back in 2009 was it really is time to get fathers more actively engaged in the conversation around how working families get work and family stuff done. So in 2009, in conjunction with a doctoral student, we decided to do a very modest study with 35 fathers who had recently transitioned to fatherhood. So men who had children around the age of 11 months or 1 year old, to try and get a sense of how their transition to fatherhood went and how similar or different was their experience from that of their working spouses. I have a big truck going by, and I'll just pause for a second. So over that period of time, we've collected information and perspectives either through surveys or through interviews of more than 4,000 professional fathers. The vast majority of them have been in the United States. And we've talked to them about a broad range of issues, from transition to fatherhood, um, to fathers' views on paternity leave, the experiences of at-home fathers, that being, dads who are stay-at-home while their wives work full-time, millennial fathers. We've looked at generational differences, and we looked at how they balance their career goals and expectations along with sort of the breadwinning and caregiving aspects. And we've been publishing this series. We've published, I think, 9 reports over 10 years, and all of them are available on our website, which I'll show you at the end of the presentation. But each year, the report is named The New Dad, and then there's a subtitle which really identifies which part of the series this is going to be focused on. What I'm going to do today is, by and large, draw from some of the larger studies we've done, but on occasion I'll say, well, this is really reflecting of the millennial dad's experience, but I'll try to identify where the information is coming from, but it will come from mainly from one of 3 or 4 reports we've done over the past 10-year period. So maybe we could just start for a second with what's the reality around how moms and dads divide their time, and who's doing what, both on the work front, paid work front, as well as on the home front. This chart is actually from the Pew Research Center in Washington. And what they did, over the years is they've been tracking through time logs how the average mother and how the average father spends their week and their work week. And so if you take a look at this chart, on the left of the mothers and on the right of the fathers, and what you see at the bottom of the 2 bars is that the first bar chart represents what mothers were doing in 1965 versus the next bar chart, 2015, and then the same will be true for fathers. What you see by looking at this is, in 1965, the average mother in the U.S. spent about 9 hours in paid employment. They spent 32 hours a week on housework and about 10 hours a week in childcare. If we fast forward, 50 years, I guess, what you see is women have almost tripled the amount of time they spend in paid employment. So the average mother is spending 25 hours a week in paid employment. That's because, as you can imagine, some mothers are stay-at-home moms, and many mothers choose to move to part-time after they become a parent. And so their amount of time has increased, but it's not as many hours per week as fathers are spending on paid work. And then housework has decreased. So they've gone from, on average, 32 hours a week to 18 hours a week on housework and domestic tasks, and they've increased the amount of childcare from 10 hours a week to 15 hours. This is all mothers, irrespective of what their marital situation is or what their work situation is. If we compare that to dads, you'll see that the bars are fairly equal between mothers and fathers in 1965, but what they spent their time on was very dramatically different. So in 1965, the average father was working 46 hours a week. They spent 4 hours a week in housework, so less than a quarter of the amount of time that mothers were spending, and 2.5 hours in childcare. Look forward to 2015, and what you see is that men's hours in paid work has decreased slightly. You may say, well, how is that possible, given everybody thinks that they're working longer and harder than it used to be? It's because there are more fathers not in the workforce right now, probably, than was the case back in 1965. And although people in professional and in managerial positions tend to work more hours, it's not really evident that people in non-exempt positions are doing the same. So they work about the same number of hours, just slightly less. And what you can see is they've gone from 4 hours a week in housework up to 9 hours a week, 2.5 hours a week in childcare up to 7 hours. So what's effectively happened over that period of time, let me just point out 2 things. One is, if you look at the bar charts on the right of the moms or the right of the dads, you'll see that, if you stack these 3 things together, moms and dads contribute about the same amount to family as has always been the case. By that I mean moms and dads are contributing in about equal hours. The difference is how they're spending their time, and what you see is that fathers are spending almost twice as much time in the workplace, and mothers are spending just about twice as much time on housework and childcare. So when we talk about who contributes most to the family, if we take a holistic view and say, well, it's not just what they do at home, but also what they do in terms of bringing in income to support the family's needs, moms and dads do about the same, but the mix of what they do is still quite different, with mothers doing about twice as much on the home front as dads do. When we talk about the issue now in terms of, what should dads be doing, and is it good for families if fathers spend more time interacting with their children and providing hands-on caregiving? Statistics and data mostly come from outside of the U.S. because fathers, by and large, have not been as engaged in caregiving as moms have. But when we look at studies that have been done both outside the United States and inside, you can see just from this kind of quick summary is that the impact of fathers being actively involved in caregiving is positive. It's positive for kids, it's positive for mothers, it's positive for the fathers, and it's positive for the most part for employers, because fathers who spend time with their children, more time with their children, tend to be more satisfied at their jobs. So the health and well-being outcomes for children and for fathers are very clear for them spending more time, and also the mental health and also participation in the workforce and career development of women is also very much enhanced if their spouse is spending a significant amount of time in caregiving. So if this is the case that we kind of say, gee, this is almost a win-win-win where the children, the spouses, and the employers are all benefiting, why is it that dads today are still not doing as much on the home front as mothers are? There's a few reasons for that. One of them, the reasons is that fathers do face a career penalty if they're involved in caregiving on what researchers call a conspicuous basis. By that, I mean, if fathers do caregiving and it's invisible to their employer, that has no impact on their career at all to speak of. But if it's conspicuous that fathers are taking time off in order to do caregiving, that may prove to be more problematic. And when I say conspicuous caregivers, just a quick example. One would be that fathers say, I have to leave every day at 5 o'clock to pick up my kids, or 4:30 to pick up my kids at daycare, and I don't really have much latitude. That would be conspicuous caregiving. Or fathers who say, I'm going to take a couple of months off when my child is born in order to do caregiving for my newborn. That's conspicuous caregiving. So if you think about the career penalty that fathers may face along those lines, women have faced that career penalty for years as a result of their caregiving responsibilities. In fact, sometimes we hear about the glass ceiling for women. A lot of researchers today say it's less of a glass ceiling than it is a maternal wall. What do they mean by that? What they mean is that women and men have fairly similar career progressions for the first 6, 8, 10 years of their career. What changes the possibilities for women and the trajectory of their career is when children come into the scene. And when children are on the scene, oftentimes mothers, are viewed by their employers as less committed to their work, less promotable. And one research study even suggested that mothers are viewed as less competent than non-mothers are. Why would that be the case? I have no idea. But what I would tell you is that there is a sense that women, when children enter the scene, become less committed to their careers. Fathers have one benefit when it comes to careers and children, and that is fathers experience a, quote, wage bonus. So when kids come on the scene, while women's wages may tend to plateau a bit, fathers tend to, for either coincidental reasons or other factors, tend to have a wage bonus. But conspicuous caregivers, those fathers that I mentioned a minute ago who say, I have caregiving responsibilities and they're very serious, suffer different penalties. One research study that was done by Birdall and Moon, two professors from Canada, showed that if even though there's a heightened sense that fathers should be doing more on the home front, those that are conspicuously involved in caregiving face stigma and marginalization in the workplace. So when dads have caregiving responsibilities, it's all fine as long as that in no way interferes with their ideal worker situation. The minute it begins to interfere with that situation, then fathers can be stigmatized and maybe even marginalized as not being as career focused as perhaps they should be. So one of the questions, I'm going to turn now to the research that we've been doing, and one of the questions we've really set out to look at is how do fathers perceive their role? And the one question we asked early on, this is 2011, and this was the first large-scale study we did. We had 965 fathers from 4 Fortune 500 companies who participated in the study. And one of the things we asked them is we laid out a continuum. On one end of the continuum, which is the top bar chart that you're seeing, was that I see my role really primarily or almost solely as earning enough money to meet my child's and my family's financial needs. On the other end, which is the lowest bar you're seeing, is I see my role as being about physically and emotionally caring for my child. And what we expected, that although we knew that only a few fathers would probably answer on either end of the spectrum, we expected that there'd be many more fathers in the middle, but there would be a leaning toward the second bar down, which is mostly my responsibility is earning money to meet my family's financial needs, but I also provide some level of financial and emotional support. We expected that that would be the big bar and that fathers would still see their role primarily, if not solely, but more likely primarily as being a breadwinner. What we found when we did the study, and there were a number of different questions we looked at that reinforced this, is that even as far back as 2011, almost a decade ago, when we asked these working fathers who were white collar, well-educated professionals with very responsible jobs, how do they perceive their role? They really saw it as a kind of a 50-50 blend between breadwinning and caregiving. And that sort of undermined some of the, the literature that said when it comes down to it, fathers view breadwinning as their primary or their most important responsibility when it came to work and family stuff. One of the other questions we've asked, and we've asked this a number of times, this just so happened to be from a study we did of millennial moms and dads, was how easy is it for you to combine work and family with your career responsibilities? And so what you see in these two pie charts is on the left is how millennial moms answered the question, and on the right was how millennial dads answered this question. So this sample was slightly different. It was people between the ages of 24 and 35 who had children, and these people worked for one of 5 organizations that we partner with at the center. What you'll find is, kind of positively, 68% of the women either agreed or strongly agreed, these are the young millennial moms, that it was easy to combine work and family with their work with their personal and family life. And, I guess on the positive front, you'd say, gee, that's great that slightly more than 2/3 of women found it easy to do that. And that may speak to the quality of the organizations we work with and the emphasis they put on work family. If you move over to the right, what you see is that a smaller percentage of fathers, only 60% of fathers, found it was easy to combine work and family, and 19%, almost 20%, either disagreed or strongly disagreed that was relatively easy to do. You might ask yourself the question, going back to a slide I showed a few minutes ago, that moms are doing twice as much on the home front as fathers are. Why would it be that fathers have a more difficult time combining work and family when they're doing less than their spouses? Many studies that have been done on working dads support the same notion that fathers have more difficulty struggling with work-family issues. One of the reasons that's probably apparent from my earlier slide is they work more hours. So they tend to be away from home, except during this virus. Most of them tend to be away from home a lot more than their spouses. The second reason is that fathers tend to have jobs with more people reporting responsibilities. So fathers tend to be more often in line management responsibilities and more often with people reporting to them. So they may have a more difficult time segmenting their work than their spouse does. And then the third thing that seems pretty obvious to me is that a lot of fathers have grown up without a role model of a dad who is a shared caregiver. So it may be less true with millennials, but certainly with Gen X fathers and baby boomer fathers, most of us grew up with a mom that was at home full time. And so we watched our dads really focus much more on caregiving while the mothers took up the responsibility for family issues. Today, we're getting to the point where a lot of millennial dads are growing up with a role model of a father who has been in a dual career couple. And so it may be more likely that today they're seeing role models and examples that are setting expectations for them that, gee, when I get married and we have children, I'm going to be expected to do close to or about half of the caregiving responsibilities. And the final reason I think fathers struggle with this more is probably reflective of the last slide I showed, which is fathers, I think, are more conscious about and more concerned about the stigma that may be attached to them if they're too conspicuous in terms of their caregiving responsibilities. So fathers may do what some researchers have called passing, almost like when they talk about people passing because of their sexual orientation. They say that fathers do something similar, which is they pretend they're always at work, but then they do everything quietly in terms of their caregiving responsibilities, so not to face the stigma that they otherwise might. One of the reasons, too, is that corporate cultures may be slower to accept the role that dads are playing today. This chart shows the answers to a number of different questions about how much do you perceive the weight of corporate culture in terms of, whether or not you'll be able to be successful in your career. And what you see is questions like work should be the primary priority in people's lives. And the gold bar represents how millennial moms answer that question. The maroon bar is how millennial dads answer the question. People that are highly committed to their personal life, can they also be highly committed to their work lives? And what you see pretty much across all 6 of these questions is that although both moms and dads are concerned with how corporate culture impacts the way they're perceived, and especially impacts the way they're perceived around how they juggle work and family stuff, by and large, across almost every question, the fathers scored about 10 points higher, meaning that they are a little more sensitive than mothers pretty much across the board in trying to keep their personal and family life kind of hidden in the shadows, while they tended to want to be perceived as somebody who was an ideal worker in their workplace. Okay, so one of the questions we've asked in almost all of our studies, and this is the question that really has told us an awful lot about fathers' aspirations versus their reality, are 2 questions that we've asked throughout. First question we've asked in almost all of our studies has been, how do you think caregiving should be divided between you and your spouse? If you look at the maroon bars, that will tell you the should be. What do fathers think they should be doing? So on the left-hand side of the spectrum is fathers are the sole caregiver. On the right-hand side, my spouse is the sole caregiver. And these are a continuum all the way in between. What you see by the maroon bar in the middle is the overwhelming majority of fathers, just a little over 2/3, say that caregiving should be divided equally amongst dads and their spouse, okay? And you can see about 30% or so think that their spouse should provide more care than they do. The second follow-up question we always ask is, how is caregiving divided between you and your spouse? And what you see there is when it comes to the should versus the is, there's a big fall off. So the gold bar says both provide equal amounts of care. About 30%, 32% of fathers said we both provide equal amounts of care. By contrast, when we ask the question, who is doing the caregiving, about 2/3 of the fathers said my spouse does more than I do. Does that make sense? So the maroon bars is what the idealized state is. The gold bars is what the actual state is. And what you see is more than 2/3 think it should be 50-50, but only about 1/3 of the times is that the case. We've done a lot of analysis on the way in which the father's answers to these 2 questions break down. And let me show you what we found. Roughly, they break down to a third, a third, and a third. So when we looked at that should be versus is question, we had 3 groups of fathers. Traditional dads were the fathers who answered the question, I think my spouse should do more caregiving than I do, and she does do more caregiving than I do. Those fathers we labeled traditional dads because that's the way you would think of dads 20 or 30 years ago, where the spouse tended to carry on more of the caregiving responsibilities. The second group are the fathers who said caregiving should be 50-50, and it is 50-50. Those were the egalitarian dads. So those are the fathers who practiced what they preached and lived up to at least their own aspirations in terms of being really a partner with their wife and doing shared caregiving with them. And the third groups we labeled as conflicted fathers. Those were the fathers that said, it should be 50-50, but my wife does more than I do. So those are the fathers that we labeled as conflicted fathers. So the traditional dads, there was a lot of congruity between their aspiration and their behavior. The egalitarian dads, there was also a lot of synergy between their aspirations and their behavior. But the conflicted fathers were the ones who were falling short of their expectation and not living up to their values around being a shared caregiver. If you think about that, one of the things we then did was we looked at all the different measures we had taken throughout our surveys. And we said, let's break the fathers into these 3 groups. And let's ask our fathers, which are the happiest fathers, which are the most successful fathers, and so forth. What you found right across the boards were that generally speaking, the egalitarian fathers were the happiest dads, and they scored highest on almost every metric that we took. The two exceptions to that were traditional fathers were the happiest on how happy am I with the amount of money I earn, and how happy am I in terms of meeting my career expectations. On those 2 measures, the traditional fathers scored the highest. The conflicted fathers on every single category scored the lowest. And let me just show you where they scored either the lowest or they scored the highest on something that suggested a negative bias. So for example, they scored the lowest on questions like, I really feel part of my work group. I'm satisfied with my progress toward my career goals. I find it easy to balance work and family. I'm satisfied with my life overall. On each of those categories, the fathers scored the lowest. The only areas where the conflicted fathers scored the highest were questions that were stated in the negative. For example, employees who take time off for personal matters aren't viewed as committed. They scored high on that. Or I think about leaving my job quite often. They scored the highest on that. So what we found when you come down to who are the most dissatisfied, the most disgruntled guys, both on the home front and on the work front, it was those conflicted fathers. So I'll come back to that in just a few minutes, but that speaks to the fact that you might have an arrangement with your spouse where she, if you're the man, you might have an arrangement with your spouse where you agree that she's going to reduce her work hours and she'll take on the majority of caregiving. And that seems to work well as far as the fathers are concerned. Or you may have an arrangement where you say, I'll do the majority. I'll do a 50-50 arrangement with my wife, but and she's agreed that would be the way we want to work things out, and that tends to lead to positive outcomes. But when it comes down to feeling like I know what my spouse's expectations of me are, I know what my expectations of me are, and I'm not living up to them, that tends to yield the lowest levels of satisfaction overall. Okay, so I'm going to move through these next few slides more quickly. This is just quickly the study we did most recently, which was on expanded paid parental leave. A lot of organizations we work with, and certainly a lot of our member companies, the member companies that I showed you at the outset of my presentation, are starting to move forward with pretty aggressive programs around paid parental leave. I'm sure the US is one of the only countries in the world that doesn't have paid leave for mothers, and increasingly one of the few countries in the world that doesn't have paid paternity leave for dads. And because we don't have that as a matter of national policy, more and more corporations or organizations and even states and municipalities have started to say, well, we may not have it as a national policy, but we need to implement some kind of expanded paid leave for parents. So we worked with 4 of our member organizations that offered gender neutral paid parental leave, meaning they offered paid parental leave for moms and dads, and it would range somewhere between 6 weeks and 16 weeks of bonding time. So that's beyond birth and recovery, but also bonding time. This was a US-based sample, and we studied new parents who had had children through birth or adoption or fostering over the past year. And we ended up with about 1,250 respondents that we could use to do the aggregate analysis. And a lot of people assume that the old adage, you can give fathers parental leave, but they'll never take it. Well, this sample, the fathers were paid 100% for the time they took off. So this wasn't like you'll make 50% of your pay if you take parental leave. They were being paid 100%, and it was for somewhere between 6 weeks on the low end company to 16 weeks on the high end. And let me just show you what we found from doing that analysis. Women, as you can expect, take the full leave that's offered to them. Of the 1,400 people or so in our study, about 2/3 were women and 1/3 were men. What we found was that 93% of the women who participated in the study took the full leave that was available to them versus 62% of men. Now you might say, well, that's a big difference, and there are still a lot more women taking leave, and that's true. But I would tell you that if we went back 3 or 4 years and asked the question, would 62% of men be taking somewhere between 6 and 16 weeks of paid leave? The answer is no chance. I think people will assume that if a man got a week off at most, or maybe 2 weeks in rare cases, that was about as much leave as fathers would feel able to take, even if the company offered it to them. But in our study, the men who filled out the response to the survey, 62% of the men said, I took all that was available to me. Even when fathers were offered quite a bit of leave, 8 weeks, fathers took on average 7.2 weeks. So 73% of them took the full leave. And when the one company that offered 16 weeks found that the average men in their organization took 12.8 weeks, and 53% of the men took the full leave available to them. So we're looking at men that are and really taking a fair amount of leave and really trying to, roll their sleeves up and take sufficient amount of leave to really understand what it means to be a caregiver. So let me just show you 1 or 2 other stats from that study as well. One of the questions we asked, the maroon bars are the women's response, the gold bars are the men's response. And one of the questions we asked is, how supported did you feel in taking leave? And we looked at a number of different constituent groups: human resources, your coworkers, your managers, senior management, your organization, and your clients. A number of the organizations that we worked with had client-facing employees. They were in consulting or public accounting or whatever it might be. And what you see there is that, again, although the men felt they had a lower level of support than the women overall, that, 3/4 of the men felt their coworkers, and more, about 2/3 of the men felt their managers were very, and this is, by the way, this is extremely supportive. So this was on, if you had a 5-point scale, it was, not at all supportive, not supportive, all the way over to supportive. And then the highest score you could give would be a 5, which would say, I consider these groups to have been extremely supportive of me taking leave. So you have 3/4 of the men saying my coworkers and human resource department were extremely supportive of me taking the leave that was offered to me. 2/3 of the men said my manager was supportive, and more than half of senior management was considered to be extremely supportive on the part of men. When we ask questions like, do you feel like your organization is more supportive of men's roles as caregivers now as a result of taking leave, the overwhelming majority, I think it was about 80% of both men and women, said yes, our organization is equally supportive of men and women taking leave these days. And paternity or parental leave, giving equal amounts to fathers, has really sent the signal that that's indeed the case. The next thing, I'm going to skip this slide and just say here, well, I'll go back just one way. When we talked, one of the things we talked about, which was challenging, was return to work experiences. So, people said, oh, my manager was very, very, very supportive of me when I was going out on my leave. And one of the things we wanted to find out was, how did you feel once you got back into the workplace, and did you feel that the organization was equally supportive? What you find is there is a difference here. Men's job satisfaction, the result of taking leave, 20% of the men said their job satisfaction when they returned to work had gone up as a result. 17% said it had gone down. By contrast, 14% of the women said their job satisfaction had gone up. 32% had gone down. Reason it had gone down, I think, in a lot of cases, is many of the people who participated in the study were involved in consulting and accounting kinds of practices where there were a lot of travel requirements and there were a lot of peak hours. And so I think one of the things that hit people after they returned to work is how challenging it was to try to balance work and family in the particular jobs they found themselves in. The other thing you should just probably take note of is you can see that while 27% of the fathers were more likely to use flexible work options than they, after returning to work than they were before having children, 50% of the women said the same. So about twice as many women were saying they were going to use flexible work options after returning to work after the birth of a child, versus about half as many men. Second thing that's worth noting is, did women and men, were they similar in terms of their thinking about career advancement and promotional opportunities after they returned to work? Just one note I'll give you is, we asked men and women on the study, what's your major concern by taking this expanded amount of leave, by taking 8 or 12 or 16 weeks leave? What concerns you about that? For both men and women, the most important concern was whether or not it would delay their career advancement. 55% of men say they're concerned about that, but 65% of women said they were concerned about that. So both men and women were very concerned about how this leave taking for parental leave would impact their career, but women were even more concerned overall. The desire for career advancement after they returned to work, 30% of men said they continued to desire career advancement versus 9% said they did not. But women, there was a much higher percentage of women who said they did not want career advancement after returning for work, meaning they didn't want to continue to increase their job level or their responsibilities after returning to work. And partly, I think that's obviously a result of the fact that caregiving responsibilities were taking up so much of their time. The second thing is, there was, in terms of opportunity for promotion, both men and women saw a decrease in their opportunity for promotion as a result of their time off. But women were twice as likely to say they felt there was a net decrease in opportunity for promotion, which probably suggests that old biases continue to exist in organizations where the assumption is that if women and men have a child, the one who's really going to have to make compromises and trade-offs in terms of their career was not the father, but the mother. Okay. I think I'm gonna just say one thing about this slide. We gave them 6 concerns, and we asked them to rank the concerns upon returning to work that were most pronounced for mothers and fathers. And what you'll see is moms and dads had very, very similar concerns. The number 1 and 2 concern for mothers and fathers returning to work: number 1, that they would have adequate time to meet their family needs, and number 2, that they would be able to manage their work priorities in such a way that it would allow them to have that time to meet family needs. And that chart at the top with the placement on the continuum, one of the things we sort of try to identify with men and women is, do you view yourself primarily as family-centric, so you'd be far over to the left, or career-centric, so you'd be over to the right? And what you see that on a scale of 1 to 5, women and men were both dual-centric and leaning more toward family-centric, which may suggest that, amongst these young parents these days, that their sense of what's important in their life and their sense of how important family is versus career is pretty pronounced for both men and women. And it's more similar than it would have been the case, again, where you might have assumed, oh, the men will be way over toward career-centric and the women will be much closer to family-centric. As you can see, they line up much more closely than people might expect. Now, this goes back to the should and is thing, and I'll just show you a few slides here quickly so we can get time for some questions. One of the things that's troublesome, and this is again from our parental leave study, was what were their attitudes about shared caregiving? So it's the same question I just talked about should versus is. When we asked moms and dads the question, should caregiving be divided 50-50, 3/4 of the men and 3/4 of the women said, yes, it should be divided 50-50. So the should be is increasing amongst men when we look at these younger and younger generations of fathers. However, there was still that drop off between the should be and the is. Mothers and fathers agreed that while it should be 50-50, that only happens in about 40% of the cases. In other cases, when we asked who does more, 54% of the fathers said my partner does more than I do. And as you can see, when it comes down to I do more, 49% of the women say I do more. Only 2% of the men say I do. So the good news, I guess, about that is 50% of the women were saying my husband either does as much as I do or does more than I do. So at least half of them consider their husbands to be equal or shared caregivers. But the problem is, obviously the bias is still, even amongst these men that took parental leave, the bias is still, if somebody's going to share the burden, it's going to be the mom that shares the burden much more likely than the dads. How has caregiving been impacted by coronavirus, and has it altered this imbalance? If you read some of the headlines that appeared in the Boston Globe and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, you would think that the coronavirus has been a disaster for women. You see these headlines like, is it a disaster for women? Are women losing ground? I feel like a 1950s housewife, and so forth. But the one study that we've seen that's been done suggested that there is still a perception difference. So the New York Times paid for a study that was done that appeared about 2 weeks ago, and it was based on data that was collected during the month of April. And what it found was when they asked questions of men and women, who is spending more time homeschooling your children, this is beyond work and family, this is now into teaching as a secondary job responsibility for men and women. 45% of the men said, I do more. Versus 39% of them saying their spouse does more. But when women were asked the same question, 80% of the women say, I do more of the homeschooling versus my husband does more. Only 3% of the women said that their husband does more. So you can see there's still a huge perception difference on the part of women and men about who's doing more. That's homeschooling. Let's look at the other 2 issues, which is who's doing more with caregiving and who's doing more with domestic tasks. When it comes down to who's doing more with housework, with cooking and cleaning, it was a little more equal. 29% of the men said they were doing more, and 53% said it was shared equally. By contrast, 2/3 of the women still felt they were doing more, and 27% said it's equal. So about 1/3 of the women said my husband is doing as much as I do or more. When it comes down to childcare, not housework, but childcare, the fathers, 35% of the fathers thought that they were doing more versus 12% thought their spouse was doing more, but still the majority of women, almost 2-to-1 over the men, felt that they were doing more, and only a very, very small percentage of 3% thought they were doing as much as that their husbands, were doing as much as they are. So although we are making headway, there is still seems to be this continuing and ongoing disconnect between what fathers think they're doing or what they hope they're doing and what mothers are doing. The most recent study I saw, that there was just one that just came out a week or two ago, and it said maybe it's more equal than we may think, but their explanation for why it may be equal right now is a lot of the responsibilities that mothers take responsibility for, driving kids to and from things, scheduling play dates, going to the doctors, those things nobody's doing right now because they're not available to anybody. So although moms and dads may be doing things somewhat more equally during this pandemic, it might be a result of the fact that so many of the things that women are generally responsible for just aren't being done now because kids don't have after school programs, they don't have doctor's appointments, they don't have sports teams and so forth. So let me just summarize the key learnings and then just say a word about why this is so important, not just to men, but to women. What I'd summarize by just saying, as I've said throughout, men express, and fathers specifically express, a desire to be more balanced caregiving, more balanced between their caregiving and their breadwinning responsibilities. Fathers suffer from and struggle with work-life conflict as much or more as their partners do, but men are more susceptible to the cultural messages of what is an ideal worker within their organization than their female counterparts. Not drastically different, but they are a little bit more susceptible to those cultural messages and more fearful slightly of being marginalized if they send a signal that they're more committed to their family than their work. Fathers want more time with their children, but in studies we've done, they say, I want more time with my children, but they also say they want jobs with greater responsibility. And those two things don't often necessarily mesh. And the theme of conflicted fathers, is something that's emerged in all of our studies. And that is that disconnect between what fathers say they want to do and what they actually do. Two important points on how this impacts women's advancement right now. In spite of the father's good intentions, given the imbalance that continues to exist on the home front, women's advancement in the workplace will continue to be adversely affected. There's no question in my mind that if women continue to do more caregiving, more domestic work, and doing it at a rate of 2 times out of their husbands, then it's going to be extremely difficult for women to reach points of equality. As I said a minute ago, people talk sometimes about the glass ceiling, but increasingly about this maternal wall, and the idea being that women will continue to advance up to the point they have children, and then suddenly their career just starts to plateau. A big reason for that is that their advancement is truncated by the fact that they are taking on the lion's share of responsibilities at home. And from an organizational perspective, I think if organizations are going to say they're truly committed to women's advancement, which so many organizations do these days, they have women's advancement programs, mentoring programs, identification of high potential, and so forth. I think the only way they can really credibly do that, is if they're also supporting fathers' roles in the home. Otherwise, they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth. In other words, we support women's caregiving role, but we don't support fathers who are playing a more active role in their caregiving role. So for organizations to really promote women's advancement, they have to not only do things to accelerate the development of women, but they also have to do things that will help their men take on a more active role as caregivers. So with that, I think I'm going to end it. All the reports on parenting that exist that we've done, I'm so sorry, are available on our website. You can see the address there, or if you want to write to us, you can write to us, care@cwf@bc.edu. So with that, Michael, I'm going to turn it back over to you and see if there's any questions, assuming I don't choke to death before I get a chance to answer them. Okay? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll give you a minute to catch up and get a few more sips. Let me ask the first, we have several, let me ask the first one, just transitioning right out of your point about organizations need to actually, focus on both, need to talk about how they're supporting the other half. Do you have either recommendations, best practices from companies that the center works with that are doing those things? And second, what do you think people within organizations, who may not be at the decision-making levels, how can the people who work in organizations, the moms and the dads and others, support and push, advance that idea within their companies?
Well, the first thing and the most conspicuous thing an organization can do is give men paid leave when they have children. That's a very conspicuous step in the right direction. And I'll tell you, if companies are expanding paid leave for mothers, they better expand paid leave for fathers, because where that hasn't been the case, or when organizations, and I'm not talking about birth and recovery right now, I'm talking about paid time off beyond birth and recovery, where organizations are um, offering women, say, 8 weeks or 10 weeks and offering men 2 or 4 weeks, that's been challenged in court. And where it's been challenged in court, it's one of the few instances where men are being, quote, discriminated against, and men who filed suits have won, because organizations are saying, by giving it to women and not giving it to men, that's gender bias, and it's gender bias in this case that's against men and men's interests. So the first thing is expand leave and make sure you're doing as much as you can to make sure it's equal amounts of leave for mothers and fathers. The second thing is, I think very few men feel comfortable discussing these issues in the workplace. It's something that women feel comfortable with, and a lot of times we have employee resource groups or affinity groups within organizations for women and for mothers, but we don't have any for dads. And I think the feeling is, well, mothers need to talk about these issues, fathers don't. But if organizations start an affinity group for fathers and start having catalyzing a conversation. A lot of times they've started parenting groups or fatherhood groups, and they've asked me to come and speak at their organizations to talk about why it's so important for men to be able to have this conversation and to be able to discuss with their own organization the importance of their caregiving role. So I've a lot of times been sort of the kickoff speaker when something like this occurs, but I think it's extremely important that men have some outlet by which to start this conversation. And almost invariably, when I've gone to organizations, the men I've spoken to after our planned presentation have said this has been the first opportunity we've ever had to talk about the challenges we face as working fathers. So I think that's a really important thing for organizations to do. I'm forgetting the second part of your question, Michael.
That was just, for people within companies, how can they effectively advocate and make the point that this is important, again, without putting themselves at risk, as we see people are legitimately concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you've got to be, for men especially, I think it's important when a male colleague takes parental leave, for example, or says, I've got to leave today at 5 o'clock to pick up the kids or whatever it might be. I think for men, it's really important for them to be allies, not only to women, but to men. And when we think about how does your workplace perceive you, how supported do you feel? If men's managers are supportive, but their colleagues make snide remarks in meetings and stuff like that, then I think that really undermines the level of support men feel. So I think we need to be allies to women in terms of promoting women's advancement and certainly recognizing the difficult balance that they strike in terms of between work and family. But when men, and especially men who are the first ones or in the early the earliest wave of men that are taking expanded leave, they need to feel supported too, because they're the ones that are sticking their neck out here and they fear career stigma. And so anytime we can be allies, including, whenever I do give talks at companies, I've asked people, could you give me a couple of men that have taken leave or a couple of men that are proud to talk about their role as caregivers, and they're on a panel with me after I present the research results. And nothing speaks better than either managers or leaders or just well-respected men who say, this is what I do to balance work and family, and this is where I put my priorities. And I think when people hear that from colleagues and leaders in their own organization, that sends a very powerful message about the importance of fathers, really playing both roles.
Great. Thanks. One question here is, does your research suggest any recommendations to help conflicted dads get out of that category and move toward egalitarian dad status?
Yeah, I think the first thing you want to do is talk to your partner, and say, I am either operating under the misconception that you think I'm not living up to your expectations, or I don't think I am, living up to my expectations. Is that the case? Do you think that, all of us, women feel conflicted too. Women have had the challenge of trying to do it all forever. And so it's not to say only men feel conflicted, but when it comes to this issue, I think men feel it particularly because they recognize they're not doing as much as they should be and they want to be. So the first point is to check in with your spouse and ask the question, do you feel like I'm carrying my share of responsibilities on this? And if not, how do you think it's working today, and how can we make some changes so that I'm taking on more responsibility for these kinds of issues? And the second, is to do some self-reflection and just ask yourself, if you're not living up to your own expectations about what you should be doing, why? There are some legitimate reasons, like by and large, as I've said before, men tend to earn more than women by and large, not universally, but maybe in 3/4 of dual career couples, the man does earn a bit more. Many couples have made a decision that your job is more important than mine because you bring in more money. Men have jobs that may have, more travel demands. So there may be reasons why there's a legitimate breakdown between men's aspirations and their reality. But I think you have to ask yourself the question, is it legitimate, or is this just an excuse? And isn't my wife operating under the same kind of conflicting roles? And, if she's able to step up and do more, then maybe I need to let go of, of my belief that only men who are 100% committed to their job are the ones who get ahead in organizations. Because by and large, being in that conflicted space is just not good for your mental health or your marriage, possibly. But I won't go there, Michael.
So a couple of questions about dates and data. One is that the Pew study showed 65, 2015. So a question about whether does that research continue? Have those numbers continued to change over the last 5 years? And then for the studies that you presented, especially the ones in the latter part talked about millennials and things, are those the more recent ones? Where do they fit in the 10+ year continuum of studies you've done?
Yeah, so the first one I showed, which was the bar chart between how you perceive yourself as a breadwinner or a caregiver, and 68% of the men said I see myself as an equal balance between the two. That was 2011. The parental leave study amongst the millennials was 2016. And the the parental leave study that I quoted was 2019. So that data was only finished up about 7 months ago that we finished that. And we are seeing some differences. For example, in 2011, about 65% of the fathers, if I remember correctly, said that caregiving should be a 50-50 proposition. This year, when we looked at the same question with the 2019 results, it was 76% of the fathers said that. So it does seem like things are shifting, but it is important to stay right on top of things, because 5 years ago, in 2014, we did a study on paternity leave. And back then, the average father thought if they got 1 to 2 weeks of paternity leave, that would be adequate, because nobody was offering paternity leave at that time. But over the last 4 or 5 years, it's been incredible how many organizations we work with that now offer fathers 8, 10, 12, 16 weeks, even 6 months of paid parental leave. HP, I think, offers 6 months now of paid parental leave. And you see organizations from Amex to Intel to IBM to Johnson & Johnson, MetLife, all expanding their parental leave aggressively for men. So I think a lot of this data holds true for the most part, but we have to keep active in terms of this stuff, because the equation is changing. I think the more fathers, for example, that take advantage of paid parental leave, the more likely it is that over the years they will be more engaged, more hands-on caregivers over the long term.
Well, I had a question whether you had studied and looked at gay men bringing up children, and are there any findings in that?
We have not done one specifically aimed at gay men, and that's something that we've definitely thought about. One group did a large national sample and were able to stratify the sample so that they could look at the results that were coming from same-sex couples. And one of the things that they found generally, and this is just a general highlight, was that when it came to same-sex couples, there tended to be less of this dissonance between who should do what. And the reason they speculated that that was the case is because, when gender norms don't sort of immediately come into play, like no matter how enlightened we think we are as men, the minute we have a child, our expectation is, well, that's the woman's responsibility first and mine second. When it both are men or both are women, those kind of built-in gender expectations don't persist. So there's a need to have a conversation around, okay, when the baby's born, who's going to do what, and how are we going to divide up caregiving and responsibilities and domestic tasks. So the thinking was, the more those conversations occur, the more likely it was that those conversations up front have a positive knock-on effect, and gender stereotypes don't kind of dictate at all in those kinds of relationships.
Which comes back to the point you've stressed at a number of points, that the conversations, whether conversations between a couple's conversations in the workplace, are so important to how this evolves going forward. So let me, as a thank you, let me ask you one question too, is as you move forward, what are your plans for kind of this year and future years based on what you've seen and what the companies that you're working with are asking for? What are the things that you are planning to look at?
Well, unfortunately, this year, everything's been sort of thrown up in the air a little bit. What our companies are asking for right now, they're talking less about women's advancement or men's advancement or parental leave than they're talking about how in the world are we going to deal with this work situation. A lot of our employers, I guess, fortunately, are in the knowledge business, and so they have white collar workers, many of whom can work from anywhere. And so we've got employers, including some major ones, who said, we're not going to open up at all in 2020. Everybody's going to work virtually with very, very few exceptions for the remainder of the year. So the preoccupation right now tends to be, and probably for at least many months going forward, the preoccupation right now is how do we enable everybody to work remotely from home, because that's the panic button that we've had to hit over the last couple of months. And so everybody's preoccupation is less around gender than it is about. But I think one big concern, that the biggest concern in that is not so much how can people get their work done, but how can they get their work done if at the same time they're expected to do caregiving for their kids and expected to be tutoring and teaching their kids. The hope, from most of us, is that we see that in Massachusetts, for example, some of the summer camps are starting to mention reopening in late June and maybe early July. And the hope is obviously that the kids can get back at school, because our employers have less concern about people working remotely than they do about how they can work remotely if they have to do daycare and education at the same time.
Well, as a 15-year member of my town school committee, I can tell you that this is after a lot of other questions, this is now the big question that we're facing, is how do we get to the fall where we all hope to be back in school, or at least to have something of a hybrid model, and there is a long way to go. So I'm not expecting any answers immediately, but you're right, it is kind of the most critical question. Yeah. I also suggest, just from conversations that we had as a group the last time we talked, that one thing I might suggest that you go back to your folks and ask is, maybe when we come to next year, should be to ask men and women, did you feel there was a differential impact on your career, on your job, because of the fact that you were away from work? Do men and women feel differently about what that meant to not have the visibility, to not be at the office? To me, that's, and this is based on a conversation I had with a couple of members of our group when we talked just the other day. Seems to me like that could be a very important question going forward, so we don't lose progress that we might have made.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we've covered, oh, wait, let me see, I have one more. I got all the questions. Oh, this was just a comment, Bob. I'll toss it. We finished. Some organizations offer full paid leave, but only on base, not on bonus. When bonus makes up a significant portion of compensation, this can be a disincentive for men to take the leave. So, I don't know if that's something you've seen at all or run into.
The one thing we've seen is that if men are going to lose pay to take leave, they aren't going to do it. So I don't know exactly how bonus systems or quota systems work when it comes to things like that, but I do know that if men think this is going to penalize them in their wallet, they are far less likely to take full leave, and that's so figuring out a way to keep somebody whole during that leave period is very important.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Brad. This has been terrific. Certainly, anyone who is watching, we have recorded it. I should have mentioned that, but since we didn't have people asking live questions, the disclosure maybe was less of an issue. And we hope to make this available so that others can see it. You can recommend it to others in the organization. Certainly, we welcome questions or follow-up comment that might be relevant to us, the committee. And certainly, you see Brad's contact information in the center. And at the very beginning of your slides, and I assume you could share those or share some of those. So a lot of companies, and I saw a lot of companies that are reflective of member companies, people who we have a lot of folks at. So there might be an opportunity for people in companies to reach out to their HR people and talk about their engagement with the center and the value that might have in this area.
That would be
So,
great.
Brad, any final comments?
No, I just wish everybody good luck through the rest of the coronavirus and everything else that's happening. Hopefully we'll all be back to sanity soon.
Thank you so much, Brad, and thank you all of us for joining us today. Have
All
a
right.
great afternoon.